Well, thank you all for coming. A full house today, so thank you all. It's our first Java with Joe for 2022. This is the 4th year we've done it, and Michael Eula has been kind enough to come back every year for us and do it. So I want to thank him for joining us again. We always enjoy his interesting facts about our county here. So I'm going to let him do all the talking from now on. So, Mr. Eula, take it away.
Thank you. Well, I want to thank you all for coming this morning. I always find it exciting to come here and share what I'm working on as the county historian. I hope with this really nice turnout that people aren't disappointed in what I'll present this morning. But I want to give a little background before I actually get into the material. I have a contract with SUNY Press. I'm delivering a manuscript to them by December 1st. And this is basically an abbreviated version of my chapter 15 in that book. The book's entitled The National is Local, Genesee County, New York, 1802 to the present. And what I've organized that history, and it's not a chronological history as much as a thematic. So I have 6 sections. And in each section, I talk about different aspects of our county's history, stretching back to the early 19th century. And again, this is one of the chapters in one of the sections. And I've entitled this, and this will appear this way in the final book manuscript, Too Often Forgotten, Female Slaves and Poor Women in Genesee County. Let me begin by saying this. Until well into the 1950s, a typical historical treatment of our country usually excluded about half of the population, which is, of course, female. The very invisibility of women in many historical works, as the historian Howard Zinn once pointed out, that was his phrase, was a sign of what he termed their submerged status. To counter this, contemporary scholars ask questions about the past relevant to the lives of women. As a result, they discovered evidence. Okay, so in order to counter this invisibility, as Professor Zinn once put it, contemporary scholars ask questions about the past that are relevant to the lives of women. As a result, they discovered evidence, diaries, public documents, letters, and a host of other materials, which I'll put in a plug for the Genesee County History Department. Our archives is replete with things like diaries, letters, etc., and you'll see some of that come up in this presentation. One example of this effort is the portrayal of the most invisible of women, at least for me, and that would include African-American slave women and poor white women. Both shared common traits. They had little power, politically, economically. They lacked basic economic resources in both cases. These common traits come up in both of those categories of women, and it is to them that I now turn in this presentation. And I'm starting with slave women in our county in the decades prior to the Civil War. So I've entitled this section, Slave Women in Genesee County. Let me start with a quote. Sympathizing with his slave, Nicholas purchased Mingo's wife, Nancy, and all her children, and brought them with Mingo to New York. And that's from a letter we have in the early 19th century, before we actually became a county in 1802. Contrary to popular belief, the dichotomy between a free North and a slave South is one that is not as pronounced as is usually depicted in a standard history textbook. The end of slavery in the northern states is far more complex than is typically assumed, and that would include our county. For example, the 1860 census counted 451,021 slaves in states and territories constituting the Union throughout the Civil War. New York, and specifically Genesee County, is part of this complex picture. In 1790, the federal census revealed that there were 21,193 slaves in New York. 10 years later, the number stood at 20,903. 15,017 slaves were found in New York by 1810, while the number continued to decline to 10,088 by 1820. 75 slaves were recorded by 1830, and only 4 remained by 1840. None were recorded in New York by 1850. So notice there was a gradual emancipation. I say gradual from the point of view of someone who's not a slave. If you were a slave, it wasn't happening fast enough, as we'll see.
Was that the whole state, or was that?
That was the whole state.
I'm sorry, I just want, I had this misconception that suddenly slavery became illegal in New York State and it just kind of went away like
No,
flipping a light switch.
it was gradually emancipated in part to placate the owners who were concerned about losing capital assets. We have to remember, just a little digression, that slavery, if you were to look in, say, a law book in 1800, whether it's the North or the South, slavery was identified, defined in the property law section. So you have 2 broad categories of property. You have real property, of course, and then you have movable or chattel property. It's in the movable chattel property category that we find the definition of slaves. So in order to emancipate slaves politically in the assembly in Albany, there had to be a series of concessions to slave owners before they were willing to slowly but surely relinquish. So it started with things like the children born, I forget exactly the year, it was in the late 1790s, it was on July 4th. Children born from that point on would be freed when they turned 21, not before then. So there was this gradual emancipation, but again, I want to stress, and I'll come back to this, slavery never took root here en masse in the way it did in a place like the Deep South. And the basic reason for that was economic. We have small, basically self-sufficient farms. There wasn't the same drive to have large labor forces such as you would see on the famous cotton or tobacco plantations. The number of slaves in New York, I'll come back to this, decreased in part due to a gradual emancipation bill, that's the year, enacted by the New York State Legislature in 1799. In part, the law set forth that all African American children born subsequent to July 4th in 1799 would be free. However, just as importantly, in contrast to the South, slavery had never become entrenched in the North, as I just stated, due to the existence of relatively small farms, in contrast to large plantations dependent upon greater numbers of laborers. Another quick digression, if you go into the Piedmont section of the South, which would include places like West Virginia, there was never the same number of slaves there. The reason for that, again, is simple to explain. You had small farms, so there wasn't that same economic drive to have a large labor force. Historians have fancy terms of the plantations were labor intensive. That's just their way of saying that you needed large numbers of people to plant and harvest cash crops such as tobacco. In any event, the federal census of 1820 reveals something about the number of female slaves in Genesee County, and that's what we're focusing on this morning. While the data does not reveal the names of the female slaves in our county, it does tell us of their location and the names of the owners. We also discover the ages of the women involved. So for example, Isaac Bennett, listed as living in Ridgeway. Now remember, the towns are going to sound different because we're in a very early period of the county's history. He owned a female slave who was listed as below the age of 14. That's all we know about her. George Bishop of Perry owned a female slave of 45 or more years old. Peter Brown of Caledonia owned a young girl not yet 14. And another somewhere between the ages of 26 and 45. That's how it's listed in the census records. The census list goes on for Genesee County in 1830. John Kratz of Batavia owned a female somewhere between the ages of 14 and 26. Nathan Follett, also of Batavia, owned a female not yet 14. So too did Assel Ensworth, listed as living in Gages. William Keyes of Batavia owned a young girl under 14 years of age, and two women aged between 26 and 45, as did Hyndman Holden, who owned one female of that age category, also in Batavia. David A. Miller, listed as residing in Mount Morris, owned a woman between the ages of 14 and 26. Nathan Rochester, whom the census records as living in Gates in 1820, owned two female slaves, one under 14 years of age, the other at least 45 years of age. We just don't know more specifically than that. All told, the 1820 census reveals that 14 female slaves lived in Genesee County. That was in 1820. Unfortunately, the federal census data does not indicate how those 14 and others before and after them may have been treated. For that, we have to turn to other sources. One of these sources is the 1867 publication of a man named Austin Stewart, entitled 22 Years a Slave and 40 Years a Freeman. In it, we discover that even before the formation of Genesee County, in the area known before 1802 as the Genesee Country. Now remember, I'm writing this for an audience that's not necessarily cognizant of our own county's history, unlike the group that's here, so bear with me. William Held, we're told in this account, who was a southern planter, decided to go north in May of 1796 in order to avail himself of the rich soil of western New York, along with the superior quality of timber, both a soil that was not exhausted and vast amounts of timber stood in stark contrast to what was available at that time in Virginia and Maryland. Hence, leaving his wife and children in the South, he took his slaves, an overseer by the name of Besley Taylor, along with the slaves, and another white man described only as Davis, on this journey north. Only the white people rode in the party's wagon, along with all of the food and supplies. Male and female slaves simply walked. The treatment of men and women in equally harsh ways was a continuation of the practices of the southern plantation. Stewart recalled that it was, I'm quoting him, customary for men and women to work side by side on our plantation. And, he goes on, in many kinds of work, the women were compelled to do as much as the men. Captain H. employed an overseer, whose business it was to look after each slave in the field and see that he performed his task. The overseer always went around with a whip, about 9 feet long, made of the toughest kind of cowhide, the butt end of which was loaded with lead, end of quote. Making their way along the Northumberland Road to New York, slaves were obligated to answer to a roll call each morning. Failure to respond resulted in a lashing. After eating breakfast, the journey to what became Genesee County continued at an average rate of 20 miles per day. When the party camped at night, the slaves slept in tents. Upon arrival, the slaves, without the benefit of horses, cleared the land. The slaves were weak from hunger. Provisions at this point were scarce, and there was little corn left, and of course there was none to purchase. Owners did not give slaves permission to hunt or to fish. Consequently, the slaves were close to starvation. Slaves were described gathering old bones, grinding them, and boiling them for food as a broth. Quick digression here. Held, of course, as a Southern planter, was treating the workforce in a way that was typical of the Southern plantations in the antebellum period, and even before that. They did not rely upon the slaves literally reproducing their own population. That, of course, meant that they had always insisted upon larger and larger numbers of slaves being imported. They were, to put it crudely, basically just worked to death, and then they were replaced. So you still see that taking place as he's making his way north, and then once he arrives. Horrific conditions, first in evidence on the trek northwards, did not necessarily subside, as I was suggesting, once a farm was established. As a January 1810 advertisement regarding a runaway female slave suggests, and I quote, "Ran away, a likely Negro girl named Linda Moody, 18 years old, about 5 feet 6 inches high. 2 of her fingers on the right hand are considerably burnt. She took a variety of clothing with her. Any person who will return said girl shall receive a liberal reward." It was signed by D.B. Ferguson Phelps, January 16, 1810. Just as tellingly, the violence experienced by slave women owned by Held while still in Virginia continued unchecked in what became Genesee County. Stewart remembers seeing his sister cruelly beaten, and again I quote from his memoir. "One pleasant Sabbath morning, as I was passing the house where she lived, on my way to the Presbyterian church, where I was sent to ring the bell as usual, I heard the most piteous cries and earnest pleadings issuing from the dwelling." And notice the 19th century style of writing. Stewart goes on, "To my horror and the astonishment of those with me, my poor sister made her appearance, weeping bitterly and followed by her inhuman master, who was polluting the air of that clear Sabbath morning with the most horrid imprecations and threatenings, and at the same time flourishing a large rod." End of quote. Quick comment here. Notice that he used the word sister. That is something in slave culture. I mean, we often forget this, Southern or otherwise. They have their own mores, values, and ways of looking at the world, but much of that was kept hidden from the owners because of their fear of punishment. To use the word sister, to use the word brother, to use the word husband or wife would put a slave in risk of a lashing, because this was seen as an emotional perspective, which gets in the way of the owner wanting to simply manage basically chattel property that doesn't think about very much except their task. So he's clearly at this point also making an innuendo that I'm a free man now when I'm writing this, and I can use the word sister. He concludes this terrible story about his sister with this, and again I quote from his memoir. "Very soon his bottled wrath burst forth, and the blows, aimed with all his strength, descended upon the unprotected head, shoulders, and back of the helpless woman, until she was literally cut to pieces. She writhed in his powerful grasp, while shriek after shriek cried away in heart-rending moanings. And yet the inhuman demon continued to beat her, and though her pleading cries had ceased, until obligated to desist from the exhaustion of his own strength." End of quote. The graphic and chilling description of the beating of an African-American slave woman produced a narrative in which Stewart reveals the trauma of a brother compelled to stand by and do nothing, despite the pleas for help of his sister. Again, quote Stewart, "What a spectacle was that," he said, "for the sight of a brother." The God of heaven only knows the conflict of feeling I then endured, Stewart added. Elaborating, he then said this, quote, he alone witnessed the tumult, he being God, of my heart, at this outrage of manhood and kindred affection. God knows that my will was good enough to have wrung his neck, and yet I was obliged to turn a deaf ear to her cries for assistance, end of quote. Stewart was, of course, obliged to turn a deaf ear because of the obvious. He reminded the reader that he is a free man and has not, I'm quoting Stewart again, from his infancy, been taught to cower beneath the white man's frown and bow at his bidding or suffer all the rigor of the slave laws, end of quote. Through the story of his sister's beating, Stewart reminds us that slaves, both male and female, found themselves in a world in which total obedience was the norm. Owners such as Helm possessed the power of life and death over their charges. Death could result from a beating or from, and this is another aspect, the emotional trauma of seeing loved ones taken away at a moment's notice. I think it's hard for us to really fully feel what it must have been like for a slave, a husband, wife, children, parents. At any moment, you could all be sold and never see each other again. We have accounts after the Civil War in the South of now emancipated freedmen who spent years, male and female, looking for children, looking for parents, relatives, friends who had been taken away years before. Some were successful, but of course for many, this was unsuccessful. Helm at one point, I'm quoting here again from Stewart, sold my Aunt Betsy Bristol to a distinguished lawyer in the village. This was in Batavia, retaining her husband Aaron Bristol in his own employ. And 2 of her children he sold to another legal gentleman named Cager, end of quote. When Betsy's husband Aaron failed to appear for work as a result of the despair he felt over the loss of his family, that failure was as much as anything else a form of resistance. Aaron paid dearly for this act of retaliation. He was beaten so badly by Helm with a, quote, stout limb, end of quote, that his, quote, face covered with blood was so swollen that he could hardly see for some time, end of quote. Slaves were dominated emotionally through such reminders, sales, beatings, etc., that owners and overseers enjoyed absolute power over them. This emotional domination was also exercised through the emotional effect of a slave's realization that there was a limitless future ahead for both the slave and his or her descendants. In other words, nothing's ever going to change. Planning for the future under these conditions remained pointless. Slaves viewed a wider New York, indeed a wider Genesee County, which bore no relation to their lives. Their only life was the life of a slave. Family life was always temporary at best. Indeed, one's own life remained temporary at best. For those slaves who even for an instance dared to hope, there were reminders of powerlessness played out in the lives of other slaves, such as a female slave named Ellen. At about the time of Batavia's ascendancy as the seat of governmental power in Genesee County, quote, the village was thrown into a state of excitement by the arrest of a colored woman named Ellen, end of quote. Ellen was charged with escape from, quote, service due to a Mr. D south of the Mason and Dixon's line, end of quote. Other slaves witnessed her forced removal from Genesee County to the south. Stewart describes her as a wounded spirit in which every earthly hope of liberty was driven from her. Skin color was the visible marker of the slave woman. Even escape to a land appearing to have more freedom did not change that. That skin color marked her as unfree and as poor. That takes us to an interesting question as well. What of the white women in Genesee County who were also vulnerable and poor? In other words, while poverty among slave women is self-evident as an inherent condition of bondage, it appears in many cases to be harder to explain among free women. These women, found throughout Genesee County, are most visible in the history of the Genesee County almshouse. That takes us to poor women in Genesee County. An examination of the available evidence from the years 1827 until the year the renamed county home closed illustrates a number of factors shedding light on the reason for finding women there. Their presence placed them a world apart from women in the county occupying a public presence, exuding economic resources and lofty status. One factor discernible in the evidence, one that is suggestive of a reason for their poverty, is the intemperance of their husbands. In a set of guidelines promulgated by the Society for the Prevention of Pauperism as early as 1818, one of the causes of poverty among married women was, and I quote, intemperance in drinking. The most prolific source of mischief and misery drags in its train almost every species of suffering which afflicts the poor. This evil, in relation to poverty and vice, may be emphatically styled the cause of causes, end of quote. Another cause of female poverty severe enough to permit entry into the Genesee County poorhouse was the condition of mothers in need of assistance due to the absence of a husband and father. An examination of the annual report of the superintendents of the County of Genesee to the Secretary of State, 1857, reminds us that the county home contained 10 females and 8 males who had not yet reached the age of 16. In that same year, 3 children were born to mothers in the county home. The records of the county home illustrate that the admission of children with their mothers was common. For instance, look at the situation of Mary Starr of Attica. In cases such as, as this, the admission of children actually preceded that of the impoverished mother, who was desperate for help. In Mary's case, her youngest child, a 2-year-old named Busheba, entered the home on September 15, 1838. Her brother George followed on December 13th at the age of 6. Angeline was admitted the following month. Their brother William, aged 9, also entered the county home on February 1st, 1839. By March 6th of 1839, Mary Starr was, at the age of 32, herself admitted. The following day, she gave birth to a child who died that same day, March 7th, 1839. So chronic alcoholism and mothers lacking the financial means to take care of children were 2 factors helping to explain the worst poverty affecting women in our county. There was yet a 3rd factor discernible in the evidence that helps to explain the female poverty at work in the county home. In the 19th century, the reference to psychological issues at work was described as lunacy. A century later, less severe terms were used, but they are still suggestive of someone's inability to adequately cope with their environment. For example, we see in the records of the State Board of Social Welfare's annual inspection of the county home in 1931 to 1932, this comment about a female resident, and I quote, "There have been no disciplinary cases since the last inspection. Miss X, blind, age 22, is a mischief maker. For her own good, she should be transferred to an institution where she can be trained. She was dismissed from the school for the blind at Batavia when she was 12 years old. End of quote. The environments many women found themselves in, be it poverty or slavery, were harsh and unforgiving. In the case of African American women before the Civil War, it was a terrible combination of both poverty and slavery. The effects of both poverty and slavery continued for African American women subsequent to the end of slavery. And this continuation of oppressive conditions is revealed in the historical evidence. Records of the Genesee County poorhouse for the years 1836 and 1837 illustrate the lives of such unfortunates as Louina Williams. She entered the poorhouse on December 5th, 1836, at the age of 65. We discovered that she was born in Africa. Dying 7 years later, her condition was described as follows, quote, "a colored lady and very decrepit," end of quote. Louina was not the only manumitted female slave to end her life in a crisis in Genesee County. Like poor white women and their children who were admitted to the county poorhouse, Dina Brown too found herself and her children dependent upon the charity of the county. Dina was accepted into the poorhouse on September 4th, 1840, at the age of 36. At the same time, so were her children. They included 14-year-old Alamina and her sister, 10-year-old Eliza Ann. 8-year-old brother David was also admitted. So too was another sister, Menina, only 4 years old. On September 20th, 1840, Dina gave birth to another child, son Edward, who only lived for 24 days. The entire family was categorized as born in Africa. It is not clear from the records if this was literally true. This suggests that at least some of the family may have been smuggled into New York subsequent to the closing of the slave trade by Congress in January of 1808. If not smuggled into the United States, it could be that the designation Africa was shorthand for what would be termed today African American. In any event, the entire family was released from the county poorhouse on May 25th, 1841. The last recorded entry about them is their listing as paupers in the care of the residents of Perry, New York. It takes me to my conclusion. In his memoir, Austin Stewart pondered the meaning of emancipation from slavery. He did so in a way that included all poor people, such as the impoverished white women of Genesee County. He said that, and I quote, "I know not why, but mankind of every age, nation, and complexion have had lower classes, and as a distinction, they have chosen to arrange themselves in the grand spectacle of human life, like seats in a theater, rank above rank, with intervals between them," end of quote. Despite his own enslavement, Stewart expressed views pertaining to the poor that were ultimately not preoccupied with skin color. Throughout his memoir, he repeatedly returns to a compassion for the poor that is largely oblivious to race. This perspective is discoverable not only in the testimonies of African American slave women and those eventually freed from slavery, but also from poor white women as well. The struggle for existence and the perennial fight to acquire basic material needs transcended the racial divide among the poor. Living together in the same circumstances in the county poorhouse, not to mention the circumstances bringing them there in the first place, softened the racial divide between poor African American women and their fellow white residents. It was this link along economic lines that Stewart stressed at one point in his memoir. Runaway slaves Rosa and her husband were making their way from Virginia to New York, moving only at night, famished and weary. They came upon a white family. Barely able to continue, Joe, the husband, cautiously knocked on the door of a home, clearly inhabited by a poor family, deep in the woods. The reader then was told that the, quote, man of the house opened it, and as soon as he saw him, he said, "You are a fugitive slave, but be not alarmed, come in. No harm shall befall you here. I shall not inquire from whence you came. It is enough for me to know that you are a human being," end of quote. Rosa and Joe received food and clothing to take with them as they continued their journey northward. When Rosa rejoiced, she did not see skin color, only a family willing to share what little they had with other human beings in need. When we're able to uncover what the poor said, as their voices are not as loud as those who historically are better off, the theme that being poor transcends race is one that's commonly repeated. As we listen, it should be remembered that poor whites in Genesee County, particularly those in the county home, merit the same compassion and attention poor African American slaves have received. There was clear oppression and denigration in both cases. The only difference is that the oppression of each took different forms. There is no denying that slavery was a horrendous and brutal system. However, so too was the harshness of unemployment and a lack of economic resources for even those employed, a harshness felt as much by women as by men. Like slaves, the poor in Genesee County tended to remain poor beyond one generation. There were many possible reasons for this, and I've only hinted at a few in this presentation. Nevertheless, along with family disarray and intemperance, there was also the specter of a prejudice against poor people, especially poor women, that translated into an excuse for continued exploitation and neglect. This brings us to a final thought, one with contemporary implications. The color line between African Americans and whites inherently kept poor African Americans in the spotlight. However, poor whites remained largely invisible, be they inside or outside of an institution such as the Genesee County Court. Now, I've made some handouts. There were many things I could have brought, but this is, these are copies, I'll just pass these on, of indentured servant contracts from Genesee County in 1842. I've noticed a couple of things about this. First of all, indentured servitude was a period of essentially forced labor. Now, in fact, we forget this now. Before the color line, as it was termed, was devised in Virginia before the middle of the 17th century, Africans who found themselves in that situation were indentured servants, and they were released at the end of their indentured servant contract. While they were indentured servants, and that included the whites in Virginia before 1650 that I'm thinking of, they were subject to all of the degradations that we normally associate with slavery, the beatings, sales, etc. So notice this contract from our county is dated 1842. Notice the attitude towards the poor that we see in this. And notice who the indentured servant is. It's a 10-year-old boy named Henry Hawkins. He's also described as a mulatto, which brings us into other areas as well. Of course, in Southern law, which is different than New York law in this period, a mulatto by definition was categorized as a slave, even though they clearly had a white background as well as a black background. He's described as a poor child who was assigned to, you'll see the name of his master. This was in the town of Batavia, in the county of Genesee, etc. And he was to serve until he was, it's typically 21, yes, 21 years old. And then at that point, he would be released. Now, whether or not he had any skills, whether or not he had any assets to actually maintain himself, that varies widely from case to case. I just wanted to give you a sense of what some of the attitudes towards the poor and the attitudes regarding forced labor, which is what we're talking about, slave or indentured servant, look like here in the county, and this is decades before the Civil War. All right, there's much more I can do, but I will stop at this point. Does anybody want to comment, have questions, critique, disagree? Yes.
Where was the alms house and the poorhouse? I know at some point it wound up in Bethany.
Is it Bethany?
It's in East Bethany. Yes, it's
So
in
was
Bethany.
wasn't that a mental institution?
It served a number of functions. It served as, excuse the term, a repository for the poor. It also was a functioning farm, which is often overlooked. It was self-sufficient. Any crops that were left over were then sold, and that was the profits were put back into the county home. So it served a number of purposes. It also served as an asylum for people who were seen as having what we now call the public health issues. If they had some kind of disease that was seen as dangerous to the public, they were put in there. What were called lunatics, we would now say people with mental health issues were put in there. So it was a whole variety of people. And notice as well, and I just gave you a sampling here of the children, some as young as 2 years old or even newborns, who are in the same environment as everybody else. So the children who are 8 years old are surrounded by people who have mental health issues, who are desperately poor, et cetera, et cetera. There was a very different notion of childhood in this country, and that includes Genesee County in the 19th century. We don't even, it's always amazing to me as a historian, but we didn't even have a notion of adolescence. I can give you the year 1890. A guy named G. Stanley Hall, we now call him a psychologist. He publishes a 2-volume work entitled Adolescence. That's the first time we see the term. Before that, people basically, and it depends on their class, they go from childhood to adulthood very quickly. There's no intervening period. The idea of a teenager is totally foreign. So the idea that you would have a 14-year-old who is at that developmental stage psychologically in the county home would have been a non-issue, say in 1840, because teenagers aren't recognized as being in their own category. So how we define children, of course, this is the period of child labor. So none of this is seen as inappropriate.
Anything left of the property?
Yes, they're still over there. As a matter of fact, now it's run Rolling Hills Asylum.
Yeah, you can pay to
Yeah,
get
you
it.
can pay to get in.
Really?
Yeah.
It's still there after all these years?
Oh, yeah.
I won't-
It's a business.
Yeah.
It's a business.
It's a business. The woman who owns it came here from California and bought it and tries to make this into a tourist venue, basically. If you walk through there, and you can go and walk through, much of it, last time, I haven't been there for about 2 years now, but much of it is still in a state of disrepair. And you can actually see where people were hospitalized and all the rest of it. And nothing's really changed.
There's a cemetery there, and
There's a cemetery.
only a couple markers. So
Right.
you can imagine how many
Yeah.
unmarked graves.
Now, whether or not a place that frankly contained much suffering should be a tourist venue, I'm not going to go down that road. That's not my place. But I'll give you a comparison. We've all heard of Auschwitz, right, in Poland. There was one point, Auschwitz, there were investors who came in after, this was in the 1970s, I believe, but don't quote me on that. But it was relatively recently, and they tried to basically make it a tourist venue.
Yeah.
And there was a cafeteria and a museum shop. This was a place where almost 2 million people were murdered. Now, the ethics of that, again, that takes us into another topic, which I'm not going to explore here. But you can go to the Rolling Hills Asylum and you can see where that suffering took place. Yes.
That was used till recently. When I was in high school in Alexander Central School, I was in the high school chorus, and each Christmas time, we go through the county home, sing Christmas carols. I was wondering, another thing you talked about is like 20,000 plus slaves here early in the 19th century. And I was wondering, are they tied to a specific industry like agriculture or home domestic?
It varied. The more privileged, if I can put it that way, slaves were tied to a craft shop of some point. At some point, they had a skill, which means they could also accumulate enough money if their owner allowed them to eventually purchase their freedom. And notice that purchase, this comes out of the legacy of the indentured servant contracts. One of the interesting things that you also saw that in the South, that's often overlooked. And there were actually free African Americans, most famous example, Charleston, South Carolina, on the eve of the Civil War. There were half a dozen free African Americans who themselves owned slaves. I mean, it's not simply about color. That's a great misrepresentation. For me, it's really, in the end, color is used as a demarcation. The reason color initially came up in Virginia in the 17th century was that you had so many indentured servants running away that it was harder for the owners in that period and non-owners to figure out who's who and who's a runaway, who shouldn't be here, should be 3 counties over. So it was literally in the Virginia Assembly decided upon, that was their term, to draw a color line, making it easier to identify runaway servants, who we would now call runaway slaves. It's a complicated story. I mean, there were the Ashanti tribe was infamous for the numbers of slaves in Africa that they owned, and worked with Portuguese, British, Spanish traders, and they would sell people that they had, say, captured in war, or people who couldn't pay a debt. They now found themselves on a slave ship making their way to the Western Hemisphere. And again, the conditions they experienced, that's a whole other story. I want to talk about the slave voyage over, but it depends on where they're going. Only a minority actually, numerically, from all the evidence we have, actually go to the American colonies. The vast majority of them go to the West Indies, they go to Brazil, they go to South America in general, particularly Brazil. And of course, it's estimated that by 1700, there were approximately, if you can imagine this, 800 different languages on the continent of Africa. So to say that there's one African-American culture is a pretty disingenuous thing. I mean, I think that often comes up in contemporary political discussions. But if we're to look at this historically, we're talking about a varied African society. And that helps to explain why it was much easier to enslave people there than it was in other parts of the world, because they were so separate from each other.
And they were cheap.
Yeah. Well, they were also easy to basically gather up. And of course, this couldn't be done without the complicity of African elites. So now we're back to the class issue. You have African creditors who will sell slaves that they acquired because the slave couldn't pay off a debt, for example. Next thing they know, they're on a slave ship making their way to the Western Hemisphere and never to be heard from again. So it's a complicated picture. And it goes way back in Africa. We have more than one account of the earliest slave traders who were Arabs, who come from northern Africa and go into the sub-Saharan region and all the rest of it. So again, that takes us beyond what we're doing here this morning. But slavery is a fascinating topic to look at. But one of the things I think is often mistakenly done is that it's politicized from the point of view of our own day. It's much more, use the word again, complicated and varied than we often acknowledge. Matter of fact, there are people who journey through the South at its at slavery's peak, say in the 30 years or so before the Civil War broke out. And they talked about slave owners who were protective of their slaves because it's a major investment. So who did they get to do the most dangerous work? Irish immigrants. Or they talk about this openly. The Irish were much more expensive. So to simply see slavery as neatly connected to race is to miss the complexity.
I was curious about several things. I don't know what first-hand resources, what the official term would be. Could you tell me the official term, such as where did this come from? And thank you for copying these for us. What
This-
were this first-hand resource, and were the alms book mostly thrown away at the conclusion of it? Or
I'll put
where
in a
did they
plug
go?
for our history department. We have, I would argue, one of the best local history archives in the country. I was blown away when I first started here and saw that. It's better, frankly, than a lot of college special collections. That is from our archives, and you're more than welcome to come down and look. We have books of that stuff. We've had many people over the years give of their time as volunteers to simply dig this stuff up, make sure it's protected, photocopied where possible. So yes, we have that.
How did you start your interest in history? Was it through your family, or was it through education, or how did it begin?
Well, I'll say this, I was fortunate enough, my parents didn't go to college, but they were very well read. Books were a big thing when I was growing up, my father in particular. Matter of fact, when he died, I still have his book at home. He was right in the middle of a book about the Stalin-Hitler pact in 1939. This is not the normal reading for the general public. So I had a passion for it, and after I got out of the service, I was trying to figure out, well, what am I going to major in? And I thought, well, I might as well major in something I really like, history. I took my first course at Rutgers, and it was a man named Elliot Rosen, who I believe is still alive. He's written much about the New Deal, Herbert Hoover, Franklin Roosevelt. And I just said to myself, literally first class to myself, I want his job. I want to do what he's doing. This is great. This is really interesting. And the more you look at it, it's like an onion. You keep peeling it, and the more you realize how much you don't know. I'm always astonished by people who say, I know everything. Really? That must be really nice to think you know everything about it, any subject or anything. But I've never stopped. For me, it's just a process of learning that has just never changed. And my kids and my wife could attest to that. Sometimes, unfortunately, they get so preoccupied, I have to remind them of other things. Yes.
My brother told me that he found the quote, "Richer than me you could never be," where I had a mother who read to me.
Yeah.
That's wonderful. Thank you for sharing that with us.
You're welcome.
Very nice. Excellent.
Does anybody else have any?
We were just, my friend and I, Steve, we wrote in from Rochester, and we were talking about the popularity of Black History Month, and what do you think? I was just wondering if you could give some general observations about, you know, how it's done well, how it's done poorly. I think some of us wince when we kind of walk past the display. It's always the 5 same people. I mean, there's nothing wrong with that.
It's funny you mentioned Rochester, because somebody from the Rochester Health Network, or I forget exactly what it's called, he actually emailed me about 2 weeks ago and asked me if I had any information on African Americans in Genesee County. I said, yeah. So I did some research, shot out an email. And he was happy that I talked about people who were obscure. There was one man here who was a Baptist preacher who used to, imagine this, in the 1930s, in the Depression, drove in to conduct services on a Sunday, and his only payment was gas. And he did this for a couple of years until he was able to get a job in Rochester. But my point, I have even forgotten his name, right? I'd have to look at my notes in my office. But he had worked to have admitted to the Rochester University Medical School what turned out to be the first Black applicant that they ever admitted. You would never hear of him. So I think 2 things. I think, one, I'm a little wary as a historian when I see the word celebrate, I think that's frankly simplistic. I don't think any history is there to celebrate. I mean, you may feel good about what you find, that's great. But history is about exploring how we got to be where we are. And I have to say, in my experience over the decades now, history is often very uncomfortable. You don't necessarily like what you're finding. So to say that you're celebrating, when I was still teaching, I had African-American students, some of them got pretty upset in some classes, when I pointed out that in Charleston, South Carolina, you had free African-Americans who owned slaves. Wait a second, that can't be, it was. Look at the evidence. History shouldn't be designed as therapy. It shouldn't be designed to make one feel good. If it happens to make you feel good because you found something you like reading about or looking at, that's great. But so I'm always wary about the term celebration. On the other hand, I'm happy to see that many aspects of our nation's history in particular have been now for 40 years, at least come to light. Black history was generally ignored. Women's history was generally ignored. Frankly, working class history was generally ignored. I mean, yeah, you had some passing reference. Yeah, we passed some labor laws in 1905 or something, without really explaining what was it like to be a 5-year-old who just arrived from Poland and finds himself working in a plant in Pittsburgh. He can't even read the safety instructions, assuming the owners even had them up in 1905. Those are important aspects as well. I mean, I'm always wary about history becoming hero worship. One of my basically my hobby readings right now is a biography of Robert Kennedy. There were many good aspects to Robert Kennedy's life, no doubt about it, but there were some pretty sordid aspects. Him and his brother, I won't go into the details. And then I'm looking through this guy's footnotes, appears to be credible. So to transform people into heroes, I don't think that's the purpose of history. On the other hand, I would also quickly add, do we need heroes? Yes. I mean, that stretches back to antiquity. I mean, look at the Greeks. They had many heroes. I think we've become so cynical because we're so quick to destroy somebody's reputation. So you look at someone like Robert Kennedy. Did he do some really good things? I would say yes. Did he do some lousy things as Attorney General, ordering phone taps that were illegal? Yes. That's all part of the mix. So when history becomes hero worship, I politely excuse myself, because I don't see that as its purpose. But I also think that having heroes is important. We shouldn't forget that, especially for children. I know when I was growing up, there were heroes. You know, there were sports heroes, there were history heroes, and as I matured and got older and learned more, yeah, they're not exactly what I thought they were, but they still have merit. I mean, I always think of it in personal terms. If someone was only to look at the bad parts of my life and never acknowledge any good that I've ever done, I don't think that's fair. I don't think it's fair for any of us to do that to anyone else. It's always a mixed bag. George Washington had many in this book, my chapter 1. I call it Genesee County's Washington. I talk about the portrayals of George Washington right here in Genesee County. Were there, and all the reading I did to get ready for that, writing that chapter, did George Washington have some good traits? Absolutely. I mean, among other things, he had incredible courage. I mean, he was willing to give up everything. If they lost that war, he would have been hanged. On the other hand, he had some less than desirable qualities. He tended to be egocentric. He tended to be really focused, we'd say narcissist, focused on himself, and yet had this image of modesty. He was complicated. And so maybe that's a roundabout way of saying, I think Black History Month, any History Month is important as long as it doesn't degenerate into a kind of mindless celebration and hero worship. I don't think that helps anybody.
Well, I was just going to say that there's a new book out about George Washington and Martha Washington's housekeeper, African-American woman that escaped. And boy, they did everything they could to pursue her.
Right. And then there were other slaves, I know this from that chapter, who escaped from his plantation, and he didn't bother going after them.
No.
So, I mean, it depends on what you're looking at.
Yeah.
You know, that's the other thing, too. one of the things I became, frankly, I was an academic historian full-time for 23 years before I retired. And one of the things I really became disenchanted with, I saw the change in my own life, looking at people coming in, they had a preordained agenda. So for example, in that case, they're writing a biography of Washington. They're only gonna focus on evidence that supports their predefined vision of how it should look. I don't think that's really honest historical scholarship. I think history should make us frankly uncomfortable.
It's muddled.
I'm sorry?
It's muddled.
Yeah, well,
Well, we're flawed human beings, and we have to understand that in order to learn. Do we learn? Probably never. It's a continuation of flaws in some glory or accomplishment. But heroes, I think, is a very weak word today, because the breakdown of our history, the ideas of history, in books, all kinds of things are deteriorating rapidly.
yeah, and there's such a quickness to appropriate what we're calling history for some contemporary political end, which again has nothing to do with serious scholarship. It has to do with people, in public office and what their polling numbers look like, et cetera. But that's not, I would argue, an ethical use of history, which is complicated, and it's not necessarily going to be what you had hoped it would be.
Yeah. A lot of the authors today, especially historians, are writing the book to sell rather than to create a learning experience.
That's
And
news.
We just received a book here within the last couple of weeks by an author from Texas. And unfortunately, he addressed a critical battle in the Civil War to start several officers' careers. And the depth in which he went in detail almost exhibits to me that he felt like he was there in writing it as if he were there, rather than the research. He did a tremendous amount of research, but he also embellished. And that's where the distortions really come. And I think we have to find authors who go back and understand how to write about the flaws and what people were really about. It's a fascinating thing to understand people and their flaws, I think.
Well, and I would add to what you just said. I think we'd all agree people are pretty complicated as individuals. To categorize whole societies, whole groups of people in one way or another is frankly simplistic. It's much more involved than that, much more complicated. I keep using that word this way, but.
Yeah, I want to say thank you because I've learned a lot today.
Great.
And I think this history is essential. We aren't taught it, and there's a lot that we have to know. And I know there's a lot of controversy today to talk about critical race theory, but I think if we don't learn from the past, we're going to repeat it. And sometimes I even wonder if somebody wants us to forget the past so that we can repeat it.
Well, you're more polite than me, sir, because I would say that there's a wholesale war taking place on historical thinking, if I can call it that. No, there's this effort to literally remove memory. I mean, Orwell talks about this. People remain dangerous to those in power. I don't care who it is in power, if they have a memory. Which is why, if you look at totalitarian dictatorships, why Stalin, why Hitler, they go after, the first professional group they go after are the historians, archivalists, Stalin, because they pose a danger.
Well, just like today, Putin, and look at it, and how the whole story is unfolding, and the lessons we haven't learned by several people who have written historically, but also journalists who have brought information to us, and we deny this. And the unfortunate thing is, it can come to our doorstep very soon, and we better start facing the reality of what the hell's going on in the world, because we're really hiding here.
Yeah, I mean, I think one could argue in our own day as well, I I think there's an argument for the idea that basically as a culture, we're amusing ourselves to death. We are so interested, and I'm generalizing, again, this is not everybody. We are so interested in being entertained. News has just become entertainment. History is supposed to be entertaining. Everything's supposed to be entertaining. Medicine has become entertaining. Without going down that road, I mean, it's rare in that's changed in my life. I can't tell you, I mean, a group like this is rare. People who actually want to think and who want to read and want to analyze, that's an increasingly hard quality to find. People just want some flip. They want entertainment. They want it in 2 sentences. Well, sorry, there are a lot of things in the world that aren't reducible to 2 sentences. You know?
Marshall McLuhan spoke to that, familiar with him?
I'm sorry?
Marshall McLuhan spoke to that.
Right,
The medium is the massage rather than the message.
right. Yeah, Marshall McLuhan, he was ahead of his time in some ways, because that's come to pass. And also the idea, like I spoke about, I mentioned this biography of Robert Kennedy. Well, I mean, there's so many terms that I hear now. What we today call liberal was not a liberal in 1960. And one of the hallmarks of what traditional liberalism was that you really believed in a free exchange of ideas. Near the end of the years I was teaching, I had a student say in one survey class that, well, I really was a dinosaur. Not just me, but anyway, it takes that position. Because she didn't believe in the First Amendment. She was a political science major who wanted to go to law school. The First Amendment, all that is a cover for oppression.
I heard,
And I think that there's a lot, frankly, I think there's a lot of that.
I'm sorry to jump in, but I heard that from my niece. My niece has a college degree. She's a very nice girl. She's a bright, very hardworking girl. She said, in fact, her degree's from SUNY Brockport. It's in health science. We have free speech in this country, but not for hate speech.
And who's defining
And
it?
because I'm so argumentative, I just let it go. But I've been pondering that ever since. What happens when the world is full of people who consider, when our country is ruled by people who consider that claim to be self-evident? I think it's going to be a different country.
We'll just ask people, who has read the Constitution? And you'll find the numbers are very few. And the original interpretation still exists today because there haven't been many changes that have been significant to address today's issues. Thomas Jefferson always felt that concurrently you should be addressing the Constitution and making changes, generations change. But yet we've neglected that, and now today we make decisions out of opinions that really have no validity based on what is written. And words are meaningful, but they don't expand to a horizon far beyond. I mean, definition really counts, and we're distorting these things. And there are certain historians like Jack Rakoff and that who have talked about the Constitution, and they look at it and they say, where have we gone wrong? People are not reading this as an important document. It's a manifesto for us.
Right.
And we should believe in this and understand it. And the Second Amendment, totally distorted, also convoluted by the Supreme Court, which is unfortunate, but we are not willing to understand why it was written.
And part of the confusion is frankly what historians have done to contribute to this. When you mentioned the Second Amendment, I'm thinking some of you may be familiar. I knew him personally. He was a full professor at Emory, Michael Eula, and he wrote a book about 20 years ago, Arming America. And it turned out, his argument, he was so intent on making the argument, making a name for himself, he got all these awards. He said that guns weren't common before we started to become an empire and industrialized. In other words, most people in the colonial period didn't own guns. And he supposedly had all this evidence. Well, it turned out the evidence was made up. You know, all these footnotes, if you just glance at Arming America, it looks credible. And it was so bad that Emory eventually fired him. But the damage was done. And he was so intent on opposing Second Amendment rights that he basically just made up the history. which is about the worst thing a
Wow.
historian could
He
do.
quoted himself.
He made up documents, and
That's right.
he had these, when he was called by others who have written about the history of guns in America, legal historians, among others, he had all these probate records. He said, oh no, there was a flood in my office, and the water destroyed the records, I can't find it. And the most lame kinds of things.
But then I continued with the book. I lost all documentation, but I continued the book.
Yeah, I mean, if you're interested, you look at Michael Eula, Army in America, and it's all over the
Well,
internet still.
I'm gonna follow up on that. Who can you name who you think are exceptionally honest historians? Do you have people who you think you could say, this guy or this woman is a model for honesty?
I'd have to think about that, I have to tell you, I don't wanna just throw out names.
Right.
I'm not evading your question, but it's a very hard question to answer off the top of my head. Most of the scholars who are attached to, frankly, to Ivy League schools, I think are very questionable. Now, I'm not saying every single one, but what I am saying is that the more credible the institutional affiliation looks, the more we should check those footnotes. You know,
You know, Michael, that's very difficult to find today too, and the listing of their resources and who they're hiring to do the research for them. Because many of these authors today make a lot of money up front, and they also hire people to go out and get the information, which isn't totally accurate.
Right.
You know, it used to be that they would do a lot of it themselves, but today, again, money and publications have dominated who really writes.
Yeah, and
It's all about the money.
following up on that, I mean, in the big research universities, not just Ivy League, places like Michigan and Berkeley and all, a lot of the research being done, a lot of people don't realize this, is being done by graduate students.
Yes.
They've got just armies of people who are themselves students and could not put themselves in a vulnerable position where people have to sign off on their dissertations so they can get done and hopefully get a job. So you're right. I mean, traditionally, historians, you go back in time, they would do the research themselves. Even in the big research universities, that's not the case anymore.
No.
The thing is, I gotta get a book a year out. It's gotta be done quick, because I'm up for merit pay, I'm up for a full professor, I'm sick of the pay of an associate professor, that kind of thing. And so we have to question that, and again, that's asking a lot, because how many of us have the time or even the access to check footnotes? I have to tell you, like this book that I'm working on for Genesee County, if I hadn't come here and taken this job in 2014, I'd have no access to this material. I was living in California. How would I have access? I only have access because it's down the hall. A lot of what people write about is determined by what you can literally do. So in their case, they've got armies of graduate students. And I wanted to get into the politics of, getting grants for this research, and does it look at the right kind of perspectives? Who's reading this? Do they agree with you, disagree with you? None of that has anything to do with investigating the past, I would say, in an honest. Well, that certainly went far afield.
One thing leads to another.
Does anybody else have any comments or questions?
Thanks a lot, Mike.
Yeah, thank you.